3 years ago, I inherited a property in the Yorkshire Dales from a great aunt I barely knew. It was a massive, detached stone house built sometime in the late 1800s, sitting entirely alone on a stretch of barren moorland. My name is Elias, and at the time, I was working as a freelance architect. The idea of isolating myself in the English countryside to renovate a historic property sounded like a dream. I didn't know it would turn into a psychological nightmare. The house was built like a fortress. The stone walls were over 2 feet thick, meaning that once you closed the front door, the silence inside was absolute. It swallowed all sound from the wind and the rain outside. Of all the rooms, the attic was the most imposing. Unlike the cramped, low-ceilinged attics most people are used to, this one was a cavernous, vaulted hall that spanned the entire footprint of the house. It was completely empty. No boxes, no forgotten furniture, just a vast expanse of bare oak floorboards. At the far end of this massive room was a large, circular architectural window, like a rose window in a church, but it had been completely bricked up from the inside decades ago. Accessing the attic required opening a heavy oak door in the second-floor hallway and climbing a narrow, tightly winding spiral stone staircase. Because of the thick stone and the lack of windows, the attic was perpetually freezing and drowning in absolute, impenetrable darkness. I went up there exactly once on my first day, sweeping my flashlight over the empty space and the bricked-up window, and decided I had no reason to ever go up there again. The disturbances began during my 3rd week in the house. I woke up one morning feeling as though I hadn't slept at all. My muscles ached, and my core temperature was shockingly low. I lay in bed, pulling the thick duvet up to my chin, trying to get warm. That was when I noticed the physical pain in my hands. My fingertips felt raw, almost tender to the touch. I held them up to the morning light filtering through the curtains and saw that my nails were chipped. Packed tightly underneath my fingernails was a fine, gritty, dark red powder. It looked like dried blood at first, but when I rubbed my thumb against my index finger, it felt like coarse sand. It was brick dust. I sat up, my heart pounding a strange, heavy rhythm. I walked out of my bedroom and looked down the hallway. The heavy oak door leading to the attic's spiral staircase was standing wide open, revealing the pitch-black stone steps twisting upward. I am a rational person. I knew about somnambulism, sleepwalking. I knew that stress or a change in environment could trigger it in adults. But the sheer logistical horror of what that meant made my stomach turn. It meant that in the dead of night, while completely unconscious, my body had navigated out of my bed, walked down the hall, opened a heavy door, and climbed a dangerous, pitch-black spiral stone staircase. And worse, it meant I had walked the entire length of that massive, empty attic to stand at the far wall, scraping my bare fingers against the rough masonry of the bricked-up window. The next few days became an exercise in paranoia. I began locking my bedroom door and hiding the antique brass key in the top drawer of my dresser. But 3 nights later, I woke up freezing cold again. My fingers were bleeding slightly, the nails packed with more red dust. The key was sitting neatly on my pillow. The bedroom door was unlocked. The attic door down the hall was wide open. My unconscious mind was outsmarting my waking self. The dread of falling asleep became a suffocating weight. I stopped drinking coffee, hoping exhaustion would keep me paralyzed in bed, but the fear of what my body was doing in the dark kept me violently awake until my eyes simply couldn't stay open anymore. Then came the night that broke me. Consciousness didn't return to me slowly. It snapped back like a rubber band. 1 second I was asleep, and the next, I was wide awake. I was not in my bed. I was standing perfectly upright. I was completely blind. The darkness around me was so thick, so absolute, it felt like a physical substance pressing against my eyeballs. The air was frigid, biting through the thin cotton of my sleep shirt, but it was my hands that registered the reality of my situation first. My arms were raised, elbows locked, and my bare palms were pressed flat against a freezing, heavily textured surface. Coarse, icy bricks. I was at the absolute farthest end of the attic, pressing my hands against the sealed circular window. A wave of terror so pure and concentrated washed over me that my knees nearly gave out. I was trapped in the deepest, darkest part of a cavernous room, completely cut off from the rest of the house. I held my breath, paralyzing myself. I didn't want to make a single movement. The silence in the Yorkshire house was always heavy. But up here, it was unnatural. It was a dead, vacuum-like silence. I couldn't hear the wind. I couldn't hear the creak of the house settling. But as I stood there, trembling violently, with my palms pressed against the freezing bricks, I realized something horrifying about the silence. It wasn't empty. I couldn't hear anything, but my skin could feel it. The atmosphere in the massive room behind me was wrong. The air pressure was subtly shifting, compressing. It was the distinct, unmistakable tactile sensation you get when someone walks into a completely dark room and stands right behind you. You don't need to see them or hear them to know they are there. You can feel the displacement of the air. You can feel the ambient temperature drop. Something massive was standing in the center of the cavernous attic, perfectly still, separating me from the spiral staircase. My chest tightened so painfully I thought my ribs would crack. The realization hit me with sickening clarity. My sleepwalking wasn't a compulsion to touch the bricks. I hadn't come to the far wall of the attic to try and get out. I had retreated to the farthest corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall to get as far away as possible from whatever was sharing the dark with me. I stood frozen against the bricks for what felt like hours. I didn't dare turn around. I didn't dare take a step forward into the pitch-black void. I just pressed my face against the rough, cold stone, tears streaming silently down my face, feeling the crushing weight of that invisible presence waiting in the center of the room. Eventually, the faint gray light of dawn began to bleed through the floorboards from the rooms below, diluting the absolute blackness just enough for me to see the outline of the spiral staircase in the distance. The center of the room was empty. Whatever had been there had dissolved with the shadows. I walked slowly across the floorboards, my body rigid, never looking back. I went down the stairs, packed a single duffel bag, and drove away from the Yorkshire Dales that very morning. I put the house on the market a week later and sold it at a massive loss. I live in a modern, single-story apartment in London now. It has no stairs and certainly no attic. My sleepwalking never returned, but I sleep with every light on because I know now that the dark is never truly empty. And I am terrified of where my body might try to take me if I ever let the shadows back in. My family has never been close. So when I received a letter stating that my great-uncle, Silas Blackwood, had passed away and left his entire estate to me, my primary feeling wasn't grief, but confusion. The property was located in a remote, heavily forested coastal town in Maine. It was a sprawling, 3-story Victorian manor that looked like a jagged black tooth against the gray sky. My job was simple: spend a few weeks clearing out his belongings, prepare the house for an estate sale, and return to my life in Boston. My name is Julian, and I am an architectural structural engineer. I only mention my profession because it is the exact reason I noticed what everyone else had missed. The house was suffocatingly quiet. The walls were thick, insulated with old horsehair and plaster, which absorbed the sound of the harsh coastal wind outside. It felt like walking through a museum of a life I knew nothing about. On my 4th day, I finally decided to tackle the attic. I climbed the narrow wooden stairs and pulled the heavy door open. The attic was exactly what you would expect: musty, freezing, and filled with old dressers and boxes covered in thick canvas drop cloths. But as an engineer, the moment I stepped into the center of the room, my brain registered a profound spatial anomaly. Looking at the house from the outside, the roofline suggested a massive, cavernous upper floor. But standing inside it, the attic felt incredibly cramped. The walls were flat and heavily paneled with dark oak, but they were far too close together. While moving some boxes near the back wall, I found a heavy, cylindrical leather drafting tube. It wasn't hidden, just buried under old winter coats. Inside the tube was a set of rolled-up architectural blueprints of the manor. I laid them out on a dusty table. The blueprints were meticulously drawn by Great-Uncle Silas himself, but they were deeply disturbing. There wasn't just one floor plan for the attic. There were 5. They were dated 1960, 1975, 1988, 1999, and 2010. In the 1960 drawing, the attic spanned the entire width of the house. But in the 1975 drawing, a new inner wall had been drafted, shrinking the room by 4 feet on all sides. In 1988, another wall was added, shrinking it further. My great-uncle had spent the last 50 years systematically building false walls inside the attic, like a Russian nesting doll, gradually enclosing himself in a smaller and smaller space. He was boarding up the perimeter of his own house. But the blueprints didn't indicate why. There was no plumbing, no wiring, no structural necessity for this. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. I grabbed a tape measure from my toolbox. The current interior of the attic was roughly 15 by 15 feet. Based on the exterior dimensions of the house, there was a void, a perimeter of dead, sealed-off space nearly 10 feet deep, surrounding me on all 4 sides. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the arrogant belief that a structural mystery needed to be solved. I grabbed a crowbar and approached the heavy oak paneling of the back wall. I wedged the iron bar into the seam and pulled. The wood splintered with a dull, muffled crack that the thick air seemed to swallow instantly. I ripped away the paneling, revealing a layer of thick drywall. I took a hammer and smashed through it. Behind the drywall was a gap of about 2 feet, and then another wall. This one was made of solid, vintage cinder blocks. It confirmed the blueprints. He really had built walls behind walls. It took me nearly 3 hours of grueling, sweat-soaked labor to chisel a hole through the cinder block large enough to fit my upper body. When the final block gave way, it didn't crash. It just slid backward into the dark, landing softly on whatever was on the other side. I leaned forward, my face hovering at the edge of the jagged hole. The silence radiating from the hidden void was absolute. It was a heavy, vacuum-like stillness that made my ears ring. The air that drifted out was freezing, but it lacked the smell of dust or wood. It smelled distinctly metallic, like oxidized silver and old chemicals. I clicked on my heavy-duty tactical flashlight and shined the beam into the dark. I expected to see a space filled with discarded junk, or perhaps signs of an animal infestation. Instead, the beam of my light cut through the blackness and revealed a massive, perfectly preserved perimeter hallway. But the room wasn't just empty. Every single surface, the original exterior wooden walls, the floorboards, the high rafters, had been painted with an unnatural, ultra-matte black paint. It was a material designed to absorb light entirely. The beam of my flashlight seemed to die against the walls, creating a suffocating sensory void. There were no symbols, no scratching, nothing to indicate a human being had ever spent time back here. Except for one thing. Sit in the absolute dead center of the lightless corridor, about 20 feet away from the hole I had just created, was a piece of equipment. It was a vintage, large-format bellows camera, mounted on a heavy cast-iron tripod. It was facing me. The large glass lens of the camera was pointed directly at the exact spot on the wall that I had just broken through. It was perfectly leveled, aligned with surgical precision. My breathing became shallow. The sheer, calculated intent of the setup was far more terrifying than any monster. My great-uncle hadn't built these walls to keep something out. He built them to create a perfectly sealed, perfectly dark environment for this camera. And he had pointed it precisely at the section of the wall he knew someone, someday, would break through. Fighting the violent trembling in my hands, I squeezed through the hole and walked into the pitch-black, silent void. My footsteps made no sound on the light-absorbing floor. I approached the camera. The brass fittings were cold. The dark slide, the piece of metal that protects the unexposed film, had been pulled out and laid neatly on the floor. The shutter was locked open. I realized with a sickening wave of horror what I was looking at. This camera had been sitting in absolute, flawless darkness for decades with its shutter open. It was taking a single, multi-decade-long exposure. And because there was no light in this sealed void, the film remained unexposed. Until I broke the wall. The moment I smashed the cinder block and shined my flashlight into the room, I provided the only light this room had seen in 40 years. I had completed the exposure. I had taken the photograph. I carefully closed the shutter, removed the large film holder, and crawled back out of the hole, leaving the manor immediately. I didn't pack my bags. I didn't lock the front door. I drove straight to a specialized photography lab in Boston, handing them the sealed holder with specific instructions to develop the large format sheet. 2 days later, the technician handed me a large, high-resolution positive print. He didn't look me in the eye when he gave it to me. I sat in my car in the parking lot and looked at the photograph. Because it was a long exposure triggered by my own flashlight, the image showed exactly what I saw when I looked through the hole. The black walls, the empty space, and the glare of my own flashlight reflecting off the dust in the air. But the camera had been sitting in the dark, absorbing whatever energy was in that room for 40 years. It captured things the human eye couldn't see in a single glance. In the photograph, the empty space between the camera and the broken wall wasn't empty. Standing in the beam of my flashlight, directly in front of the lens, were dozens of tall, distorted, translucent figures. They were impossibly thin, their features blurred and stretched as if they had been standing there, perfectly still, waiting in the absolute silence for decades. And every single one of them had their heads turned, looking directly at the hole in the wall, looking directly at me. I never returned to the house in Maine. I let the county seize it for unpaid taxes. But sometimes, when the house is completely quiet and the lights are off, I sit in the dark, absolutely paralyzed, wondering if the darkness is truly empty, or if they are just waiting for the light. My name is Marcus, and 5 years ago, my work as an archivist took me to Copenhagen, Denmark. My firm had rented a 17th century merchant's house for me in the old district. It was a beautiful, towering structure of dark brick and heavy timber, originally built to store imported goods from the harbor. Because of its massive, thick walls, the house possessed a strange acoustic quality. Once you closed the heavy front door, every sound from the street simply ceased to exist. The silence inside wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, dead, and absolute. During the peak of the Danish winter, the temperatures plummeted. The house relied on old cast-iron radiators that struggled to keep the massive rooms warm. I spent most of my time in the second-floor master bedroom, bundled in sweaters, enjoying the profound, uninterrupted quiet. Above my ceiling was the attic, a sprawling, uninsulated cavern that spanned the entire length of the property. I had looked up there only once. The previous owners had left dozens of antique, heavy canvas ship sails hanging from the massive wooden rafters. They draped down to the floor like a maze of thick, pale curtains. It was visually disorienting and freezing cold, so I never went back up. The first sign that I wasn't alone didn't come from a noise. In a house this silent, I would have heard a footstep a floor away. The sign came from the ceiling. I woke up one morning in late January and noticed a perfectly circular, dark, damp spot on the plaster ceiling directly above my bed. It was about 3 feet wide. My first thought was a roof leak, but the winter was so cold that any snow on the roof was frozen solid. There was no melting water. I stood on my bed and pressed the palm of my hand against the damp plaster. It was warm. A deep, primal wave of nausea washed over me. The attic above me was entirely uninsulated and exposed to the sub-zero winter air. The floorboards up there should have been like ice, but the plaster above my bed was radiating a distinct, localized, and intense heat. It was the kind of heat generated by a massive living body resting directly against the floorboards, creating so much thermal energy that it was causing condensation to bleed right through the ceiling. Whatever had been sleeping above me was huge, and it was hot. I stood in my bedroom, paralyzed by the sheer, crushing silence of the house. I hadn't heard a single creak. I hadn't heard a single shifted weight. If I hadn't noticed the visual anomaly on the ceiling, I would have had no idea something was there. I knew I had to check. I couldn't sleep in that house knowing there was a thermal signature of that size hovering right above me in the dark. I grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight, went out to the hallway, and pulled the attic hatch open. Immediately, the atmosphere confirmed my worst fears. Instead of the biting, freezing draft I expected, a wave of thick, humid air rolled down the ladder and hit my face. It smelled foul, a dense, metallic odor mixed with the sickeningly sweet scent of stagnant breath and wet wool. Trembling, I climbed the ladder and pushed myself up into the absolute blackness of the attic. The beam of my flashlight cut through the humid air, immediately illuminating the first layer of the hanging canvas sails. Because the heavy cloths were draped from the rafters, I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. The attic was a soft, suffocating maze of pale fabric. I began to walk forward, pushing the heavy canvases aside. My movements made no sound. The silence was so profound, it felt like I was moving underwater. With every canvas I parted, the heat grew more intense, and the air became harder to breathe. The humidity was so thick that condensation was gathering on the lens of my flashlight. I reached the center of the attic, the area situated exactly above my bedroom. I pushed aside the final heavy sailcloth and found a clearing. The floorboards here were covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of pale gray dust, decades of accumulated dirt. But in the center of the clearing, right where the floor was warmest, the dust wasn't flat. There was an impression left in the powder. It was flawless and deep, as if a massive weight had been pressing into it for hours. But the shape of the impression defied logic. It was a long, narrow groove, nearly 10 feet in length, flanked by the imprints of multiple, sharply angled joints that looked entirely too long to belong to a human. It looked like the mold of a colossal, elongated insect that had been lying perfectly flat on its stomach. I stared at the shape, my brain completely failing to process the biology of what I was looking at. But then, a far more terrifying realization hit me. The dust surrounding the massive impression was perfectly smooth. There were no tracks leading into the clearing, and more importantly, there were no tracks leading out. Whatever had been lying there hadn't crawled away through the maze of canvases. I froze. The absolute dead silence of the attic felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't sweep my flashlight up. A single, warm drop of liquid fell from the darkness above and landed squarely on the back of my neck. It didn't make a sound, but I felt the distinct, physical displacement of the air directly above my head. I felt the massive, radiating heat hovering just inches above my hair. It hadn't left the clearing. It had simply pulled itself straight up into the black rafters when it heard me open the hatch. It was clinging to the ceiling right above me, hiding in the dark, watching me look at its bed. I didn't scream. I knew instinctively that breaking the silence would be the end of my life. Moving with agonizing, excruciating slowness, I kept my flashlight pointed at the floor and began to walk backward. I slid back through the heavy sailcloths, step by step, my eyes locked on the empty floor, never once looking up into the rafters. The heat on my face slowly dissipated as I neared the hatch. I climbed down the ladder, silently eased the hatch shut, and walked out the front door of the house into the freezing Copenhagen winter. I left my passport, my clothes, and my luggage. I walked to the nearest hotel, locked myself in a brightly lit room, and never returned to that merchant's house again. To this day, the memory that haunts me the most isn't a terrifying face or a sudden jump scare. It's the sheer, suffocating silence of the encounter. The knowledge that something so impossibly large could exist in the dark, breathing the same air as me, without making a single sound.